Welcome back all, Dr. JC here, week 4, part 2. In this part we're going to build on the discussion we had in part 1 on the French and Indian War and the impact of that French and Indian War. I made mention that it was going to help lead to American colonists starting to see themselves as maybe more American than British and leading to this revolt we know as the American Revolution. So in this part, we're going to look at a few salient events and a few salient battles as it relates to the American Revolution, and then talk about the American Revolution itself and its impact, especially on the French. As mentioned in the previous part, the British were hugely successful from a land acquisition standpoint, especially in this French and Indian War or 7 Years' War. As also mentioned, while the British were successful, it was a very costly war. Their national debt ballooned, it was out of control, and therefore the Parliament and Crown had to do something to balance their budget, to bring their finances under control. And as a result of that, they began to change colonial policy. One such policy was the Proclamation of 1763. They will also look to start to collect some revenue from the American colonies in the form of this thing called a Stamp Act. One of the important things to remember about the Stamp Act is that it really depended on where one lived as to how this Stamp Act was perceived, received, and reacted to. If you were to ask somebody in London town in England, "Hey, my dear fellow, what do you think of the Stamp Act?" You'd probably have someone look at you as if you were like smoking happy stuff. They would have no idea what you're talking about, because it was a modest piece of colonial legislation that really wasn't even followed. Yet for folks in colonial North America, whether it be in Boston, Philadelphia City, or Charlestown, doesn't matter, up and down the eastern seaboard, people were enraged over this piece of legislation. You have to remember that for almost 150 years, the British Parliament and Crown had allowed Americans here, British colonial Americans, to govern themselves, tax themselves, largely. Yet here in 1765, for the first time, we're going to see a direct tax, straight for revenue, to be placed on the American colonies. And the John Hancocks and George Washingtons of the world were not going to have any of this. Being as far removed from the event in age as we are today, it's easy for us to look at and hopefully recognize both perspectives. From the British perspective, it's simple. You American colonists created a global war, produced this huge drain on the treasury. Folks in London already pay 20 times the taxes as you, and therefore for ongoing defense and protection of your colonies, we are going to ask that you pay for some of that protection and defense. Pretty simple. Yet from the American perspective, this is a little bit crazy. I mean, for like 150 years, we've been able to govern ourselves, tax ourselves. And you've trusted us, you being the Parliament and Crown, for this entire time period. Yes, we've had royal governors, but we have our own elected bodies. And our own elected bodies pass laws and ordinances and collect taxes and do all those sorts of things. So what in the hell has changed in 150 years that all of a sudden you need to come in here now and rein us in? Britain's American colonists are so upset, in fact, that they begin to put into place non-importation agreements. They say, you know what, if you're going to play this game, we'll play this game too, and we're not going to buy your stuff anymore. And when your merchants back on your island start to feel the pinch, their profit margins start to go down, their inventories go up, your second and third shift's going to be laid off, guess who's going to go ahead and back off? You, Parliament, and you, the Crown, because your people are going to be pissed, and the people that finance your campaigns are going to be pissed. Therefore, we are going to band together as colonies. We're not going to buy any British goods, and we'll just wait until the people start to blow up your elected officials' Twitter accounts. And guess what? They were right. The British will repeal this act a year later, but it won't be without some debate and trepidation back in Parliament and with the Crown. Largely because if you do repeal this act, what are you doing with your British American colonists? You're rewarding bad behavior. That could be a dangerous game to play. And as we'll see, it does turn out to be a pretty bad idea and dangerous game to play. Just as this Stamp Act is going to help American colonists begin to come together and start to see themselves as Americans, another event a few years later in 1770, one you may all know a little something about, this Boston Massacre occurs. And when this happens, it will definitely start to bring together America's colonial leaders. Rather than go into detail about the unfortunate incident on King Street or this Boston massacre here, rather I'll include a couple videos that I shot the last time I was in Boston to help flesh this story out a little bit. I will make mention of this here, that the American media's portrayal of this event, as depicted here by this engraving by Paul Revere, the one you guys maybe come to recognize, it was wildly inaccurate. And while I know it's hard for any of us to believe or accept that the American media would try to mislead us at any time in any way, that was the case here. And as a result of this portrayal, it inflamed, in fact, enraged American colonists up and down the eastern seaboard. Now, it's worth noting here when I mention American colonists, I'm not talking about all American colonists. And while we're not going to get into the details here of the American Revolution, that's for another class altogether, do understand that only about a third of British colonial Americans are going to be considered quote-unquote patriots during the war. Somewhere between 30 to 40%. That's it. Another third will remain what's known as loyalists, individuals loyal to the British Parliament and Crown, and another third that, quite frankly, don't give a rat's behind one way or another. They just want to be left alone. Thus, do keep this in mind when weighing these events, because Americans in the age of the Revolution were not in lockstep with one another any more than they are in the political realm today. They're not. Among the myriad of different events that unfold that lead to this American Revolution, I'd be entirely remiss if I failed to mention this event depicted here on this slide, the Boston Tea Party. While I will include a couple videos that I shot in Boston relating to the Boston Tea Party in this lesson as well, and you can view those videos if you'd like, I will simply make mention that the Boston Tea Party should be remembered, as mentioned here on the slide, as one of history's greatest acts of gesture politics. I mean, think about it for a minute. Most Americans, if not all Americans, have heard of the Boston Tea Party. And in fact, if you go to Europe outside of America, individuals know of it too. They do. What's curious about that fact to me is this fact. No one died. Why the hell does everybody remember this event when no one died in it? And this is where this idea of gesture politics really holds merit. We remember the event because it was an utter act of defiance. Nobody got hurt. But this is like the biggest double middle finger you can stick up to the British Parliament and Crown. I mean, when these guys started tossing these crates of tea into Boston Harbor, this was direct defiance of British law. This is like a 13-year-old challenging their parents in a public place. This ain't going to end well, because that type of behavior is not going to go unchecked. And the British couldn't afford to allow the Bostonians and their bad behavior to go unchecked, because if they could do it in Boston, then you can do it in Charlestown, or you can do it in Singapore or anywhere else in the British Empire. Britain will rein in its American colonists, and it's going to start in Boston, where all the rabble-rousers exist. And as a result of that, the British are going to pour troops into Boston. They will close the port of Boston, and it just goes downhill from there. And open fighting, open warfare will begin shortly. The American Revolution will truly be on. As most of you are well aware, the so-styled shot heard round the world, the opening firing of the American Revolution will take place on Lexington Green, these battles of Lexington and Concord. And while the engagements are too numerous to talk about here, I will highlight two specific events, the battle at Saratoga and the battle at Yorktown, immediately after I talk about this other important event that takes place during the American Revolution, and this thing called the Declaration of Independence, America's open declaration to the world of its independence and the impact of that. America's Declaration of Independence was penned by Thomas Jefferson. Most of you know that. However, his original document, his original draft, was changed. It had to go to committee, this committee of 5 depicted here, where some of Jefferson's language was, if less clarified, because it was already pretty clear, it was softened, all right? For example, Jefferson would say that all individuals should have certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and not the pursuit of happiness. Property. Life, liberty, and property was in Jefferson's original draft. That comes directly from John Locke, directly from the European Enlightenment, which we talked about previously. This is the embodiment of an enlightened document, the Declaration of Independence. Yet Mr. Franklin himself, Dr. Franklin, would say, well, Mr. Jefferson, I understand what you mean by property here. You Southerners have property in the form of slaves. Some of us don't necessarily agree with that. Therefore, maybe let's change this language a little bit and replace property with the pursuit of happiness. So you can see in some ways where Jefferson's document was edited, painfully so to him himself by all accounts, but it was changed so that once it went to the regular body, the body could read it, which they did on the 2nd, and on July 4th, 1776, the document was ratified, and America had at least declared its independence. Now it had yet to win it. Regarding the actual fighting and America's eventual victory, Americans can thank the French for that victory. Because without French intervention that won't come, spoiler alert, until victory by the Americans at Saratoga, but without this French intervention, Americans would have continued to hold a British passport. They simply would have. There's no way the colonists themselves were going to be able to defeat the power of the British Empire by themselves. They needed assistance. The French provided that. And as mentioned previously, the French had some motive here, yes? After all, they had their nose rubbed in it during this French and Indian War, lost a lot of turf, lost a lot of land, were interested at getting back at the Brits. So the French thought they had much to gain here as well. It's not going to end up that way. In fact, it's going to end up really poorly for King Louis. We'll see that in the next part when we talk about the French Revolution. Yet before we start talking about chopping off people's heads left and right, as will be the case in the French Revolution, I want to talk briefly here about those two battles already previously mentioned, Saratoga and Yorktown, because they are the decisive battles of the war. The Battle of Saratoga, fought in New York in 1777, October of, is going to be important for a couple reasons. First, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, probably, no, in fact, for sure, a better playwright than he was general. He's going to wind up surrendering one of Britain's northern armies. They're going to surrender to the Americans under Gates. Interestingly enough, Gates in his reports will claim that he was the Mac Daddy. He was the one instrumental in causing the British to surrender. In reality, Gates never left his tent. It was some guy named Benedict Arnold who was responsible for American victory here. So as a sidebar here, I'm going to give a little props and shout out to Benedict Arnold because before he turned a traitor, he was responsible for many American victories, Valcour Island and others, all right? So there are various reasons as to why this guy turned turncoat, so to speak. We'll save that for another discussion, or I'd ask that you guys Google that on your own. But the British will surrender a Northern Army, and as a result of that, Benjamin Franklin in Paris is going to work some magic, continue to work his magic, and the French are going to agree to an alliance. Therefore, with the American victory at Saratoga, the French are now on board, and for the so-styled United States, small u, capital S, this is huge, because now you have French arms, you have a French Navy, but most importantly, supplies and money. French entry into America's Revolution, the last of these so-styled colonial wars, actually has a great impact too, because it forces Britain to fight a global war. Britain can't focus all of its efforts in colonial North America. It has to protect its possessions throughout the globe. This is now a global conflict. So in that regard, French entry siphoned off British troops, British naval power from North America, which helped America's cause as well. The capstone event or battle of the war will take place in Virginia in October of 1781. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, is going to be forced to surrender a second British army here. And with the loss of a second British army, with this many years of fighting, with it looking like it's going to go on endlessly, the War Opposition Party in Britain's Parliament will win out. The War Parliament Party will fall. A new government will be brought into power and they will focus on peace. They push for negotiations. Talks will be held in Paris. And in 1783, a Treaty of Paris will be signed and America will be officially declared an independent set of states. What was thought once to be an impossibility is now a reality. Yet what did victory mean for the Americans and the French? We'll start with the French. Just as the British had accumulated a huge war debt in the French and Indian War, the French will do the same in the American Revolution. Enormous amount of debt. And as a result of that, the king's going to have to go back to his French people and ask for taxes. They're going to get pissed. And this thing called the French Revolution is going to start. Talk about that next. But what about the Americans? Fought to make yourself free, yeah, you did. But perhaps now you're up against a larger fight, perhaps one that still exists today, the fight to make yourself happy. Dr. JC out. Part 2 here. We'll head to the French Revolution in Part 3 next.